All right, welcome everyone to another Classic Lutherans video. Jared and I are streaming today on this inauguration day and MLK Day and college football championship day.
What is up today, I swear?
Very, very crazy, right? We're just going to discuss evangelicalism and liberalism. And by liberalism, we kind of mean that more broadly than just like, we don't just mean like our modern evangelicals progressives, or are they like do they buy into woke movements or things like that, or anything like that specific to like the past 20 years or something like that. We're talking more broadly than that. Are they liberal, meaning do they borrow strongly or are downstream from the liberal tradition, which begins with Enlightenment liberalism, although there are perhaps proto-liberals, I guess you could say, in the Renaissance era. But we're discussing more so, are they downstream from, the liberal movement as a whole? Are they heavily influenced by it? But that will matter to other things like I was talking about. That will matter to, are they buying into CRT or LGBT stuff? Any of those things that is tied in. Just a few steps down the road, I suppose. It's down the chain of causes. So the way we got on this conversation actually was I believe it was Jared. Weren't you talking about a friend? You were talking about a friend that was considering Lutheranism, and he said something along the lines of he needed to be. He said that he would read the Augsburg Confession or something. But
I can say it if you want.
Oh, yeah,
I remember.
You go ahead and say it.
So I have a friend who I really like him, a nice guy. And he was telling me after he came to my church's Epiphany service, he's like, yeah, I'm going to look more into Lutheranism and read the Augsburg Confession. I'm like, great. Well, you have any questions? Just let me know. And he goes, I think I'm going to let the Holy Spirit guide me on this one.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's common evangelical language. We're not trying to like make fun of them or something. But it is relevant to the point, because then we got in the discussion of like, okay, where is this type of language coming from? It's actually kind of based in a sense, right? Like it's kind of actually like a good attitude, like, yeah, let the Holy Spirit guide me. But I think we'd probably have a little bit different meaning to what that phrase means than probably what he meant. Yeah, being guided by the Holy Spirit is very good. But we would probably say that happens more so through trying to follow the scriptures and their plain meaning. Right. But anyhow, that got us talking, and Samuel was talking too about how he had the experience of him in like Bible studies with some of his old evangelical friends, and they were talking about how, or he was talking about how if he would cite the church fathers to them, he'd say, something like Athanasius said this thing or something like that. He'd have Catena on his phone, Catena app for commentaries on whatever passage they were going through. And that would like immediately kind of silence the room, like in a bad way, as in like people didn't really care for it. They would kind of just not say anything in response and move on. But if he said it as his, like just said the same thing, but just left out that Athanasius said that thing, then people would be like, oh, it's really good insight, because, they thought maybe he had been like, in some sense, guided to that by the Holy Spirit, just from, his reading of the text or something. And this was related too, because it gets on the grounds of, goes towards like Nuda Scriptura, of course, meaning the naked scriptures, the bare scriptures, meaning, it's this idea of sola scriptura, but taken to the extent that you can't have any, or not you can't, but, historical testimonies and things like that are not taken into consideration. It usually also comes with like kind of a skepticism of philosophy more broadly. But what that ends up doing is you just end up importing the philosophy of your age, unsuspectingly. Right. Your subconscious philosophy. I don't mean that like in a Freudian sense or something. I just mean like the general presuppositions you have from your life. That is what you're bringing in, which is highly influenced by your culture, what you were taught in school, your parents, all sorts of things, right? What country you're in. But that is heavily related, because that gets on the talking then, if that's kind of how they're, approaching the text, that really is a form of liberalism in the end, right? Because it's this idea that it's very individualistic, right? You're like pulling in your own take as like kind of the take. And I don't mean that like private interpretation goes out the window, but what I mean to say is that you aren't really caring what people of the past have said. And obviously, like not everyone in the Enlightenment liberal tradition like did that. Some figures actually did have quite a lot of respect for people who came before them. But there's definitely this trend in Enlightenment liberalism, and then also liberalism forms that came after, I guess you could say, post-Enlightenment liberalism. There are takes, that are pretty much like, okay, we are going to largely throw out everything that came before. You read more extreme figures like Voltaire or Rousseau, and they are really kind of questioning almost everything that came before them. Skepticism kind of led to the Enlightenment in a lot of ways. Like Descartes kind of building from a skeptical foundation to get to his foundationalism. And the same with, the empiricist side on the other side, where the empiricists are kind of, building from a skepticism and saying, well, we can at least trust our senses or something like that. I'm way oversimplifying here. That's not exactly what they say, but that's kind of the conclusion they end up coming to, is that they can trust their senses, and therefore they build from an empirical grounds up. So anyhow, so that's kind of how we got on this topic. I think there's also the idea that like we know more now. Like, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, Jared, but people will, if you like cite like an older commentary or something like that, and I don't just mean like the Church Fathers or something, like if you cite, like someone from like 1800s, some like major Baptist theologian or something, and you're in evangelical circle, some people might like respect that because they might like that figure, if it's like Spurgeon or something. But on the other hand, people might just be like skeptical, like, well, it's older, like maybe they didn't have as much information or something, so like it could just be wrong. I've noticed that's kind of a common thing.
Yeah, I haven't spent as much time with, frankly, people who think about things way too much as evangelicals. A lot of the evangelicals, I don't want to be mean. I'm not saying I haven't. I do have some friends that have, but a lot of the time it's not just, okay, well, it's these older figures that are commenting. I've had times where Baptists, evangelicals have been skeptical about the entire idea of commentaries. So I can't speak.
Oh yeah, that exists too.
Yeah, I remember telling people, I'm like, I was with some friends who are Baptists, and I was saying, like, one of the things you should do when you read is there are commentaries. Like, this stuff is really helpful. And one of the Baptist leaders was like, well, I think first you should just read it on your own and like not do the commentaries. And like, I understand, I guess, where that's coming from, because, you do want to have, you don't only want to be formed by other people. You want to develop your own reading comprehension at some level. And there's a very serious sense in which some people can be so devoted to commentary, so they're not actually gathering the meaning of it as applied by the Holy Spirit in some sense. But that's like not at all what they meant. It's very much like figure it out yourself. Like that's when it's really special. That's when the Holy Spirit's really working, is if you know it apart from any means. What I also notice, and this is more, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but what I especially notice just looking at how churches do things is a lot of the time they're very negative towards older traditions and older practices. What I think of is all the time charismatics and a lot of just more normal evangelicals will speak of like, oh, we're doing things new here. We do church differently here. It's like, you do it in a way that no one's done it before, as though that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that's, and I think that's liberal tendency in and of itself.
It is.
Like you go to the French Revolution, which is kind of like, right, that's the major event of liberalism, right? Like that is like the thing that kind of the philosophy of Enlightenment liberalism builds up to, is like the French Revolution. I mean, there are others too, but that's the biggest one. And like the whole two sides, right? You have the revolutionaries, and then you have the ancient regime, to use, or I don't know how to pronounce French, so ancien regime or something like that. I don't know. It looks like ancient regime, but without the T on the word ancient. So whatever that is in French. But anyhow, the old regime, so the old monarchy, so those are the two sides. You have this revolutionary spirit that really is throwing out so much of their tradition and history, and not just from a political perspective. It's about culture and stuff too. It also includes religion. And then you have on the right, literally on the right side of the right side of the literal legislative body in France. On the right, you have the supporters of the old regime, the monarchy. So you kind of have those two sides. That's where left and right comes from today. So when someone's a leftist in this sense of the term, it literally meant they sat on the left side of the legislative body in France, meaning they were the revolutionaries. And so these things go hand in hand, that, evangelicals would kind of think this way. I think it is certainly downstream of the liberal tradition. They might not consciously have that in mind. In fact, they probably don't. I don't think they do. But, maybe a select handful do or something like that. But I think that's a tiny minority. I think most of them are unaware that this is probably where the idea is downstream of, being skeptical of everything old and just being like, we do it new here, we do it different. I don't think most of them probably don't have the philosophical basis to be, trying to think through that issue anyhow. I don't think most people in general do, right? Most people don't have most people aren't going back and reading Voltaire or something, right? Or Locke. Maybe you read tiny bit of Locke in high school once, read a few paragraphs or something, but most people are not, going back and reading these, early modern period thinkers. The average person isn't, certainly.
Well, Hiller's pupil brings up an interesting point here, that usually people with the more modern commentaries, because of the ancient Near East and the context of the New Testament. And I think that's it's not bad to have that kind of attitude, but it is kind of funny to me how evangelicals are like, oh, we can read all this ancient Near East stuff. And I know a lot of, I mean, there was a book that was I think it was called The Circle Maker or something, where it's this Jewish a thing, definitely an extra biblical source between the Old Testament and New Testament. They're like, wow, this is so serious. But as soon as you touch on, okay, here's how the Christian tradition develops and the church fathers, immediately it's how,
yeah,
it's oh, they'll love ancient Near East to understand the Old Testament and stuff prior to the New Testament. And then as soon as you get to people who are covering the New Testament and in the era right around the New Testament, it's well, these are extra biblical ideas, these are just traditions and we shouldn't take them so seriously. They're very standoffish about that a lot of the time. Not always. Yeah. And I think it's important to say, I always have to say this for every single video I make about evangelicals, so I'm exceedingly clear. This does not hold for every single evangelical, but I do think it's a pretty massive trend. It's a pretty serious trend to see all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's really hard to talk about evangelicals in a really straightforward way, because we'll get to that. Well, actually, we'll talk about this a little more later, but evangelical is a really hard term to pin down and what it means. It's extremely, even if you do give a relatively clear definition of what you mean by that, it's still usually a very broad group, no matter which kind of way you're going to use that term. Which is something in Brian Wolfmueller's Has American Christianity Failed, which is largely talking about evangelical American Christians. Something that I'd critique about his book, and it's a critique that is somewhat unavoidable without giving 1,000 caveats everywhere, which would probably make the book flow poorly. Is that I think probably 75 to 80% of the book applies to any given evangelical, and then 20 to 25% doesn't. And it's not the same 20-25%. It's each evangelical is probably critiqued by 75 to 80% of the book, but a different 75 to 80%. So some parts won't hit with any given person. I think the solution, at least in his book, would have been adding a short chapter that's just kind of qualifying, or maybe put it in the introduction somewhere that's some of these things do not apply to all evangelicals or something like that. And I think that would ease the evangelical reader if you're giving it the book to an evangelical and they're not considering Lutheranism, but you're giving it to them to be hey, look, I have critiques of this and I'm a Lutheran, they're a friend or something. I think that would ease the reading experience, because I could see someone reading that book and getting kind of offended or up in arms, oh, I don't think that. There's an evangelical. When I read the book, I was already Lutheran, but when I read the book, I was I think I would have been frustrated by the book because maybe only 70% of it applied or something, and 30% or something, didn't. And I think I would have gotten kind of, I don't want to say angry, but kind of frustrated with it.
Yeah, I I feel similar. I have to say, I mean, most of what he said totally applied. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that when I read it, I'm like, yeah, this does not apply to the evangelicalism that I was raised in. But I can totally see where it wouldn't. I mean, like, I'm not like, I have some evangelical friends who are like, yeah, I'd be fine with infant baptism. I'm like, what? Like,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like such a different, like, there's a very broad like term. It's like I considered myself an evangelical, but you know, that didn't mean I was like, you know, like the same stream of evangelicalism as you were. Like
right.
we came from different streams, and we definitely shared a lot of presuppositions, but yeah, we definitely did not come from like the exact same streams of evangelicalism. Definitely not.
Right. And that's just what makes all this stuff really hard to critique. I think we can notice broad trends, and that's why I make
Yep.
all the videos I do about evangelicalism and say, you know, this might not apply. Like, somebody could totally comment on this kind of video and say, well, like, I'm an evangelical and this doesn't apply to me. Like, okay, maybe, but I mean, the vast majority of evangelicals I've encountered, this is going to apply.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we discussed some of those ideas. I do think discussing like the idea of modern self is relevant here too.
Yeah.
Back onto the topic. And actually Jordan Cooper's made this series about the modern self. I think he did 3 videos on it, going through I'm forgetting the author's name of Rise and Fall of Modern Self. Which is actually kind of funny note. I believe that's right, The Rise and Fall of Modern Self.
Something like that.
Let me see. That's the title. Rise and Triumph of the Modern
That's
Self.
it. Rise and Triumph.
Rise and Triumph. It's Carl Trueman, and he kind of went through that book and talked about it. And something that's funny actually about that, rise and triumph, or rise and fall, rise and decline, like that phrase comes from Edward Gibbon's rise and decline of the or rise and decline of the Roman Empire, I believe. Or no, sorry, it's just the decline of the Roman Empire, but like the phrase kind of got like taped on the rise and decline, and then like it became this thing to use, and then it became taken on by other people, like the decline of the West, or the death of the West, as one by a modern political theorist. But those like all terms are all kind of, you know, downstream from Edward Gibbon, and Edward Gibbon himself is this very liberal figure. I mean, there's it's not that there's nothing good in the Decline of the Roman Empire volumes, but there was a lot of speculation, a lot of the data that he had, like he's kind of speculating on things that we have data on better now that is just shows it's false. He kind of blames Christianity for the fall of the Roman Empire, which has been critiqued many times since then. But anyhow, back on to topic once again. But I thought it'd be worth mentioning that comes from a very liberal book. Not everything in the Great Book series is good. Or is great, rather. Anyhow, so I think this is worth talking about. I think the Enlightenment idea of persons, for example, is a relevant thing. It plays out both in individualism, which we've already talked about a decent amount here now, with like scriptural interpretation and things like that. It kind of makes the faith atomistic. This is actually, I think, where like revivalism is, you know, heavily influenced by liberalism as a movement. Like America kind of gets a lot of liberal presuppositions baked into its culture, because of some of the political theories that go on when it's being settled, some of this philosophy in general that's like coming in late 1700s, as like there's like America founds itself as its own nation state, or kind of an empire. I guess it was a confederacy at the beginning, but it's a collection of states under a single head government. And, you know, because the philosophy of the founders is influenced by liberalism quite strongly, maybe not as, you know, extreme version as the French, but nonetheless, I mean, has a lot of liberal presuppositions. That kind of gets baked into the culture strongly. And so, and this happens even before the founding, of course, too. This is already there. That's how the founding, you know, happens in that milieu. But the Great Awakenings of, you know, various sorts do have this like really, I think, individualistic idea of faith, which is down when that comes from Enlightenment ideas about individualism and how people kind of atomize themselves.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that this shows up, the way that I have seen this most explicitly showing up is when I talk about something like closed communion with evangelicals. And it's like, okay, like at the very least on the idea of communion, you want to be, I mean, not even just on that, but you want to be in agreement with the people around you when you commune. Like, and of course there are going to be some differences at some point, but you want to be agreed with them on a lot of things where you can truly say, yeah, I am in the same faith as this person. And a lot of the time when I've talked to them about it, they're like, well, why though? Like, isn't it community between me and God? It's like,
Yeah,
well,
yeah, that's I've heard the exact response before.
yeah,
like verbatim.
yeah. That's the atomism showing up there, because they think that they can,
Yeah.
you can be, in a lot of ways, it's like you can be a member of a congregation without contributing or actually allying yourself, so to speak, with everyone else in it. It's like, well, I'm a member and the congregation is kind of like me and just like a bunch of other people around me. And then God's there.
And English people brings up that social tritheism is garbage. And that's actually the next point I was going to make was, this idea of persons, of how persons are conceived, kind of as a thinking being specifically, leads to the social trinitarianism, which is tritheism ultimately. The idea that each person of the Trinity has its, each has its own mental like brain, kind of has its own mind and its own intellect, to use the technical term. And this is definitely downstream from that. Absolutely.
Yeah, William Lane Craig and others will talk about like 3 centers of consciousness.
Yeah, that's the language that's typically used.
That's the language they use. I have to say, A.S. Bruno here, maybe I pronounced that wrong. I've talked to them a good amount of times, but he brings up evangelical churches are such a mixing pot of beliefs. I've seen Arminians and Calvinists communing together, and then he says,
"Oh, absolutely,
Paedovats greatest." Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Dude. Mm-hmm. And not just. And this is what I was having a conversation about this with some evangelicals the other night, and one of them was saying, "Oh, denominations come out of like pride, and like when we go to heaven, people are going to be saved, and they're going to have different beliefs. Then we get there, and we're all going to be together." And my response was multiple things. One is, when you get to heaven, we're all going to agree because we're going to find out who's right. And your humility is going to say, I was wrong if you were wrong, right? Like, you have to realize that there is a correct interpretation of the variety of beliefs. And when you get to heaven, it's not God like, doesn't matter, dude. Like, it's okay. It's going to be, like, I saved you in spite of these things. I am merciful. And now you are going to believe the right things because you are in a perfect state. But as part of that, I mean, he's talking about denominations as being like prideful and all these things. And I had to bring up to him, okay, well, everybody at some level has to divide if you're going to have these different beliefs in certain key areas. Like, sure, you could tell me, oh, like they'll talk about Calvinism, but of course it's not actually like full on, Reformed theology. It's usually just tulip or something. Like, sure, maybe at best you could have tulip and like some Arminians in there, but then would you fundamentally want to go to a church where, for example, your pastor's like, hey, look, you need to baptize your kid because that's going to save them. Like, that's the ordinary means of salvation. Would you want to do that if you don't believe such? Like, do you want to go to a church where they're telling you that you are neglecting the means of salvation for your child? It's like, probably not. At some level, these kinds of things have to happen, and we can't just pretend that we have unity and that, churches are just a group of people that get together and don't really share the same beliefs, because they have practical effects and implications.
Yeah, I mean, like, when I was growing up, we went to a church for a little while that was an evangelical Presbyterian church, so kind of like one of these moderate Presbyterians, and they wanted my parents to baptize me, but I was my parents are Credo Baptists, so they didn't baptize me. But one of the other pastors was more lenient on it and let them retain membership, which I'm not sure that is in line with the presbytery, but I'm not gonna out them right now. So, but the other pastor was not so happy about that.
Yeah, I would not be happy about it myself.
yeah, it's something. The next thing I had in mind was that evangelicals kind of go where the wind blows.
This is huge.
And let me put it this way. So I think evangelicals, this comes with being downstream of liberalism in a sense. They kind of absorbed liberalism because it was in the milieu of the day. But a large part of American Christianity, which is often coincides with evangelicalism, kind of just, goes where the culture goes. And I don't think that this is so organic or grassroots. Oh yeah, there's Toby. Toby's behind me. Toby is named after Tobit, by the way, from the book of Tobit. So there he is. So they kind of go where the wind blows. And one way this plays out, for example, is that you get people like Rick Warren like being good with women's ordination, right? He like ordained his wife to be like a co-pastor with him. Andy Stanley literally just Andy Stanley's just a complete progressive, actually. Like there's literally like he's not a conservative in any sense of the word. Like he is okay with like LGBT stuff. He's like he denies like scriptural inerrancy. He has really strange views in the Old Testament. It's actually worse than I originally thought after reading about him a little more. There's actually a great video by Ask the Pastor on this, Joshua Sullivan. You should check that one out if people are interested. Or like Carl Lentz, he's the guy from Hillsong who is very lenient on LGBT things.
Well, and I'm sure that you know that I think it's Carl Lentz who was not defrocked, but he basically was found to be in an affair.
Yeah, he had that was a whole thing. He did get removed from staff.
But the thing that's key, and Kozar has this in his video, like it seems that, and this is, I guess this is alleged, so don't, allegedly, Hillsong was like actually kind of aware what was going on, and they just kind of kept it going.
Ooh. Another one I have that was like David Platt with like CRT stuff. Gosh. So yeah, I mean, it's like inescapable. They kind of go where the wind blows, and actually, it's fitting that's MLK Day today, because so many evangelicals actually like love MLK. Like I went to I'll call it a reform school growing up. It was a school started by a Reformed church, a CRC church, so Dutch Reformed, kind of the moderate Dutch Reformed group, and but it was largely kind of just like a evangelical school, because it had people from all different denominations as teachers and staff and things like that. But it was a broadly evangelical school with maybe a slight Reformed bent, and we had like MLK Day chapel. Where the whole chapel was not about MLK himself necessarily, but you did talk about like the things MLK did and the social side of the civil rights movement and things like that. And it was taught as being like a Christian issue. It wasn't taught as this is like, I guess, cultural or political theory or something like that. That'd be rather advanced probably for an elementary or middle school anyhow, but it was taught as a Christian thing. Like this is something Christians are obligated to support. And I think this goes right along with where the wind blows. Like if the mainstream of America, and that goes for, either side of political aisles, for example, or different cultural movements, if the mainstream is going a direction, evangelicals tend to go in that direction. And there's some exceptions to that, but like this is a very common thing. So like all the premises of like MLK stuff have all just been like accepted by evangelicals, and if you kind of deviate from it, you can get some rather harsh looks, much more harsh than believing like modalism or something, which is insane.
And I think that's what's key here. We're not even trying to say like we have some disagreement with it, but it's like look at the priorities that they often have, right? Like if you question things that are like socially unacceptable, or what becomes socially unacceptable in light of culture, to them is much more serious than like actual theological heresy. Not as though we're trying to say that automatically something being culturally acceptable is bad, but that what you have to look at is the priorities here. I've seen so many people that will be, just completely outed or like kicked out, all these kinds of things for things that for questioning certain social ideas. And meanwhile, I've seen other people in those same groups just teach straight heresy, and they're like, well, we have room to disagree. And
yep.
that's the issue, right? Like we're not trying to make commentary on, what we affirm and deny on other things, but
yeah. And I think it's worth noting, like the civil rights movement and MLK specifically, that idea has become very ingrained into American culture as a whole. I mean, hence we have MLK Day. But that is built, more importantly, I'm not talking about American culture as much, not the topic of the stream really, but you are talking about where the wind blows, right? And but that movement was built on quite strong liberal presuppositions. In fact, much more radical presuppositions than someone like Locke or something like that. It is definitely much more downstream of the far more radical ideas of someone like Voltaire or something. Not to say Voltaire would have believed the same things necessarily, but I'm saying that it's downstream of that. It's downstream of Voltaire. It is downstream of ideas like Marx and things like that. So definitely liberal in the full sense of the term. I mean,
Right.
it is like a peak example of liberalism taken to far conclusions, actually. So the fact that that has become super ingrained into evangelicalism to the point that if you were to disagree in a lot of circles, that would be considered horrible, like literally worse than like a Trinitarian heresy. That just really proves the point of how much evangelicalism is so downstream of liberalism.
Well, and I think part of it is, and this is just, well, think of this, right? We talk all the time about, or it's important to discuss how we like liturgical, just the church year, right? The church calendar. Yeah. Meanwhile, like American Christianity just does not have that, really. They have Easter, they have Christmas, and then beyond that, it's not much else. But all of them, of course, know like the American holidays. But you try to press them. All right, how about you celebrate things like? Well, here's a really good example. I was talking about Epiphany, and I was like, oh, well, this day celebrates the baptism of Christ. Not Epiphany, but like another day, of course.
Yeah.
And what's one evangelical was like really skeptical. Like, well, how do you know that? Like, how do you know that's when it was? It's like, how about you just recognize it's a celebration? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. How do you know Christmas was on December 25th?
It's like, well, and my point here again is not to say, oh, we're disagreeing with conclusions of all cultural events or anything like that, but to say, in a lot of ways, like the cultural events have become so ingrained that it's almost seen as Christian in itself.
Yeah,
like that is a conclusion of Christianity as such. Not okay, mate. Perhaps the conclusions are in line with Christianity, but not that they are immediately leading to this idea.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole frustrating thing to see how the culture has significantly influenced them and that you can't question anything. And what I think of, what I've been thinking of is this question, like, what is evangelicalism going to look like in 50 years? Because like as society just
no idea.
Well, as society, frankly, in my opinion, is just going to become more and more and more degenerate. Like, what are they going to be supporting then? Right? Like,
I have no idea. It's going to be like, yeah, I'm like, do you think about things like sexual ethics? Like, evangelicalism has totally gone where the wind blows on sexual ethics.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's just behind slightly, back when, like new contraceptive methods were coming around, like evangelicals were against them at the very beginning, but then they like kind of just slid in line. And, that kind of has been how they've gone. Like, women's ordination has become much more common over time in evangelicalism, kind of like just egalitarianism in general of feminism has become much more common over time. And then, now even, you have evangelical churches that are sliding on LGBT stuff. This is all like, part of it's all the same idea. It's just, evangelicals are just, 20 years behind or something like that.
Pretty much. That's honestly a way that I look at it. Like, a lot of the time it's kind of like those memes of like, Turning Point USA.
Oh yeah.
When it's like in 50 years, it's like, you see, they're the real bigots,
Yeah. Yep.
Like they're the real ones, guys. We support everything society supported in like the early 2010s, all that kind of stuff.
The 2010s were the golden age,
They were. and that's what it is. Like a lot of the time that conservatism is reduced in their thought basically to what happened. Like what would Ronald Reagan like? That's kind of what it is.
Yep.
In a lot of ways.
It kind of is. There's some, political machinations of certain figures who had neoliberal backgrounds involved in that, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's just it's frustrating to see because it's like you can't actually support legitimate conservative ideas that Christians throughout history would have supported. I have found it, honestly, like if you're to talk about politics with an evangelical a lot of the time, you're going to get further if you can prove your point with like a founding father than if you would with like Augustine.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Definitely. Which once again just goes down to prove the point. Yet again, they appreciate the founding fathers who were largely had liberal ideas, and and they like that. And then, but if you cite Augustine to them, it's they don't really care that much.
No, exactly. Any other thoughts on this? I don't really have way too much else at the top.
No, I'm down to go on to like the next topic of the stream, kind of.
Before I forget, Christian said, "You think the only difference between egalitarian and a full-blown progressive is 20 years?" That's right. That's right. Like in 20 years, all the egalitarians can do that. So what's next? Let's look.
Evangelical history. So I think it is helpful to provide some like background on evangelicalism. So like evangelical, obviously the term is from just the Bible, like evangelos, right? And Lutherans called themselves evangelicals. And you even get groups today like Evangelical Free Church, which doesn't have the word Lutheran in it, but that came from Lutheran Pietism. And evangelical for that church, at least at one point, meant Lutheran Pietist, like a Lutheran Free Church, pretty much. But now it kind of just means evangelical in the modern sense. If you go to any free church, it's just going to be standard evangelicalism with maybe a little bit like a pietist influence here and there or something. But as the term has been used more recently, evangelicalism kind of forms as like the Evangelical Alliance in the Second Great Awakening in the 1840s. While it did have usage back going to like the Methodists and Anglicans in the U.S. of evangelicals were like these more low church variety. And the Evangelical Alliance in the 1840s is kind of downstream from that movement. But the modern idea of it kind of forms from there. But then that even further shifts closer to what we think of it as today during like the debates on fundamentalism and liberalism. So, and I think this is really more so where the founding of the term is today. Although the term is even shifting meaning today, which we can talk about in a bit. But what you had was this debate between late 1800s to early 1900s. You had conservatives, which are often called the fundamentalists, and then you had liberals. Now, not all conservatives are fundamentalists. There were people who were more so just like traditional confessionals. So like confessional Lutherans were not really fundamentalists, because what fundamentalists did was they said that you could have agreement on the fundamentals of Christianity, and you had to hold to those very strongly, but you could have pretty much unionism otherwise, so you could be a Presbyterian and say an Episcopalian and a Baptist, and those three groups could like have union pretty much, maybe not an institutional union, but they could have like communion pretty much together, full communion, but as long as they agreed on the fundamentals. They defended the fundamentals very strongly, hence where they got the name fundamentalists from. And the fundamentalists are talking about like the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, these types of things. Often other issues got mixed into that too. Like for instance, creation in the 6-day creation was considered a fundamental by many, even though we wouldn't really consider that like a primary or secondary fundamental article. The 6-day creation is probably a non-fundamental article, but it is the official position of the LCMS. We're not trying to deny it or something. But doing theological triage here. So the fundamentalists are kind of like they're these conservatives, but they're kind of unionists too. And so they were the major factions. You had these fundamentalists, and you had the liberals, and the liberals were trying to deny these fundamentals generally, like the virgin birth and things like that. This is really similar to just the rationalist movement of the 1600s. If you're familiar with rationalists, like the Lutheran Orthodox are fighting against rationalists who are denying miracles and things like that because they say it's against reason, which rationalists, to be clear, were Enlightenment liberals. So this is all, this is hence the term liberal that's used now for these liberal groups that deny things like the resurrection or the virgin birth. Euler's pupil says Socinians, which is, yes, Socinians is a great example of these rationalists. A lot of Arminians were also rationalists, not all of them, but they kind of buddied up with Socinians for political reasons. Those are kind of the groups you get. And so those are at odds with each other. And a lot of people got kind of fed up with the fighting or wanted to find like alternative solutions. So this is moving kind of into the 1900s. You have neo-orthodoxy. So neo-orthodoxy is one possible solution. They're moderates. And I think it's worth going on a small tangent for this because we did have a comment on one of our videos. I forget which video it was. It was a Redeem Zoomer video, thank you. That someone said neo-orthodox aren't liberals. So a brief excursus on this. The neo-orthodox are, I suppose, categorically moderates, but they are really moderate liberals. They weren't as liberal as the liberals of the early 1900s, but they are much more liberal than the fundamentalists or the confessionals. So, for example, many denied inerrancy. That would include Barth, Brunner, Gogarten, Thurmanison, Kramer, Torrance, and Bonhoeffer. So that's like, and I know not all of those figures are strictly neo-orthodox, but they're also big figures that are kind of neo-orthodox adjacent or like downstream. But some of those, that list included all the main guys though of neo-orthodoxy, along with some others. A bunch of them denied natural theology, like Barth, Gogarten, Thurmanison, Kramer. Some had unusual ideas on the atonement, like Torrance, T.F. Torrance, that is. And some Neo-Orthodox adjacent figures like Niebuhr or Tillich, they also had weird ideas on the atonement. A lot of them had modernist anthropologies like Golgarten, Thurnason, Kramer. Once again, some had loose ideas on fundamentals. So like Barth denied that the virgin birth was a fundamental. He wasn't denying the virgin birth, but he was denying that's a fundamental. And Bonhoeffer didn't clearly affirm historical resurrection. He affirms,
I think there's a passage where he might, but he's like not nearly like even
it's
if
just
he did,
vague,
he's not
is what
nearly
it
as clear as others are.
Yeah,
on this kind of issue.
I want to be. Yeah, he doesn't clearly affirm a historical resurrection. He might have. I am skeptical, but you can read certain passages to say that he did. But if you can't find, he wrote a lot. If you can't find any passage in him that clearly affirms the historical resurrection, that is kind of a problem. So I'm not saying he denied it. I'm just saying there's no clear evidence, or there's no evidence that he clearly affirmed it, which is a problem. And then there's just general, so they were fine with associating with more liberal figures like existentialists and things like that, or just liberals. But they aren't full-blown liberals. They have a higher view of scripture than like the liberals did generally. While they were like denying inerrancy, they had a different view of what that meant than the liberals. And they weren't denying as many fundamental articles typically. So they were trying to push things in a more conservative direction than the liberals were. But I mean, just look at what we just said. I mean, that's fairly liberal.
Well, and I think Barth also infamously says that I think he also pretty much denies that God is outside of time. Like he's very clear that God is in time as well.
Oh yeah, that's a big problem.
That's a massive problem, actually.
Yeah,
like that's and a lot of that is going to be, and I can't say as much. Okay, if Barth did the case. Sorry, we just. Oh, this is a pretty funny comment. Oh, yeah, I love this cosmic septic. I think that's a really funny name. He's Trump's president, guys. Like, I don't know. I just think that's hilarious. It's great. Well, but a lot of the arguments that I find today for evangelicals saying these kinds of things, like God is in time and all that, is not based on, okay, here's the scriptural convictions. A lot of it's like, well, if God's not in time, how do we relate to him? Like, we want a more personal God.
Yeah.
But anyways, right, go back. Continue what you were saying.
Good point here, actually. Evangelical anthropology is very liberal due to their denial of original sin.
Yeah.
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, not directly to anthropologies, but about the idea, goes back to the idea of meliorism is the term that is used, but the idea that there's like man is endlessly perfectible. And so pretty much, if men are inherently good, or at least neutral, if they are put into a good culture, they will like push forward indefinitely and make a utopia. So the utopians of the early modern period, that idea is kind of taken into evangelicalism, and they're not necessarily utopians in the strict sense, but they have this idea that man can just keep on being improved and stuff. So one note on this term here, while we're talking about like the history of evangelicalism and whatnot, evangelical today kind of does have a political sense to it. I thought of this because of the Trump is president message, but it almost has like a political idea behind it even more than it does have a theological idea. And Ready to Harvest talked about this in his recent video on conservative church monikers. But you have people who identify as evangelical who are like Jewish or Hindu or atheists or agnostics, just like things that are not at all like Christian, and they will identify as being evangelical. So it kind of has become a political term almost, for certain views. But anyhow, so all that talk about neoliberalism, back towards where's evangelicalism come to the picture? Where is this evangelical founding that I was talking about that comes in the early 1900s? And here it is. Evangelicalism forms as a split off from fundamentalism to be more moderate towards liberalism specifically. And one of the things that is specifically they were more moderate on was things like creationism. So they were much more okay with like theistic evolution and things like that. And while there might be some people who are more conservative who go in that direction, as a whole, I think it's fairly obvious how that is a direction a concession towards liberalism. And so what they would say is, fewer of these things are fundamental than the fundamentalists are saying, and we're actually willing to concede to liberals on a lot of points. And the reason they did this was because a lot of people saw fundamentalists as being rather extreme, and so they wanted to have like an alternative version of Christianity that was not liberal, but was more appealing to people who thought the fundamentalists were kind of crazy. And it probably didn't help that fundamentalists at the time required things like, for example, a premillennial dispensationalist, specifically the pre-tribulation version, was by some considered a fundamental, which is absolutely insane.
Seth, I'd say it's a fundamental.
Was that?
I'd say it's a fundamental.
Oh, you say it's a fundamental? Oh,
yeah. I think premillennial dispensationalism is required to be Christian.
It's required to be
Christian. My video, I've affirmed it. It's necessary. Actually, I think you're all heretics for denying it. But no, seriously, like it's funny to say that's a fundamental when, well, what about throughout all of history?
Yeah, premillennial pre-tribulation dispensationalism is a very new view, as it turns out. We don't need to go into the history of that view, I suppose, but
we don't.
It's a dubious history.
But I think one thing suffice it to say, though, that is relevant is when I bring this kind of stuff up, I'm like, to people, I say this is fairly new. They just kind of don't care.
Yeah, and they like new.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, you'll have people that they'll be this side. Todd White is an interesting figure. He's kind of like, to me, he's like in between evangelicalism, word of faith, and new apostolic reformation. But one of the things he says in a video, and it just always strikes me, he says in this video where he's introducing a church that, hilariously, he talks about it as, oh, this is gonna be such a massive thing, and like within a year, it didn't happen. Within a year, it just fell apart. He says, oh, we're gonna radically transform the way the body of Christ looks at church. Like, that's not a good thing. Like, you think, like, why do you think we want to change how it's been? Like, do you think the church has just gotten it wrong forever?
Some people do. I think that is actually what a lot of them think.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that's what the idea behind revivalism, right? The church got it wrong. Like, after the apostles died, everything just went haywire for roughly 1900 years.
Do you mean restorationism?
Oh, sorry, yeah, restorationalism.
Let's say it.
Yeah, sorry, not revivalism, restorationalism.
Yeah, I'm working on I'm hoping to work on a script soon, right? I go through, and because there was a really good question that we had on one of our videos, like, how does Luther differ from the restorationists? And like, I'm looking at, I think it was specifically, I'm going to do it specifically with the object of the New Apostolic Reformation in mind, since that was a context of my original video. But I'm going through, and it's just like fascinating to see what their kind of attitude is. I remember talking with a family member about like how in Lutheranism we don't have like an altar call and all this stuff. And he's like, well, do people even get saved there? It's like, do you think people prior to late 19th century didn't get saved in churches? Like what happened? Like, do you think nothing occurred?
No, nothing occurred. Everything from that time, after the apostles' death until very recently is nothing really happened. It's all the Dark Ages.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the Dark Ages. That's my favorite. They'll talk about like the Dark Ages, and it's like even the Lutherans, we won't say that about like the medievals. Like, we'll say there's some errors there, but there's a lot of phenomenal stuff in it. A lot of phenomenal stuff the medievals have.
And there was a magazine. Apologize, my keyboard is loud. There was a magazine in the evangelicals that was from the 1900s, Christianity Today, which obviously still exists. And it was so it's Billy Graham, 1956. So this is heart of the so-called Fourth Great Awakening, if you can call it that. And I think this is like the central defining moment of what made evangelicalism as we know it today split from fundamentalism, and made it distinct as a thing from previous forms of evangelicalism, I guess. It's not that previous forms of evangelical are independent of this. This is definitely downstream from those. But I think like the way we conceive of evangelicalism today is specifically downstream from this moment. This magazine was specifically aimed by Billy Graham and others along with him at bridging the gaps between fundamentalists and liberals. That was the point of the magazine, which just shows, yes, evangelicals are categorically like moderates of sorts. They are not the so-called conservatives of the world. So yeah, this is actually, I think kind of the founding the movement as we know it today.
Yeah, well, this is something that I have talked about. So Well, something I've noticed, and I told you this before the stream, but I think this is especially relevant when you talk about things. So, yeah, that's right. Well, remember that video that I made, that live stream I did a while back, where there was this guy who straight up says, if you don't support Israel, then you're an enemy of God. Like, that guy just straight up does. Like, that's a thing. Like, and this guy, I mean, I guess he thinks so. You're an enemy of God if you don't support national Israel, man.
You have to support national Israel.
And and throughout that video, my whole point was like, I actually don't know much about the issues, and I could see arguments for both sides, but I'm not going to condemn somebody on the basis of Christianity as such as to which side they take.
They're opinions on geopolitics.
Yeah, like your geopolitical opinions are. I'm sorry, that's not an article of faith. But what I was talking with you about before the stream was even when we get evangelicals that will like agree with social conservative ideas and historic Christian ethical teaching, they're really like apologetic about it. Like they are not happy to be affirming this. So let me give a comparison here. And now part of this is one of them is a concrete event. Another is one that, I mean, I've kind of, made up, but it is, I've seen this happen multiple times and I'm just, adapting it to concretize it for comparison here. There was a time when, somebody showed up to a church I was attending as a Lutheran, and I've been going to this church for a while, and somebody that I didn't recognize there showed up, and after the service they said, I'm really interested in Lutheranism, like, do you support LGBTQ people? And the pastor said something like, well, we believe it is a sin and sins can be forgiven, but no, ultimately we do not support them in this respect. And this person's response is, well, thanks for being honest. I'm going to go look at the ELCA church. And this pastor's response was, there you will hear the word of man, not the word of God. And I think that's a fairly good way that we would approach it. We would say, no, this is a sin. This is a problem. But we don't look at this as though, it's completely irredeemable. Like, you are an irredeemable person, all these things, but you still have to recognize this is wrong. Whereas the way I have seen a lot of evangelicals approach it is more like like the Bible seems to say it. I could be wrong. And, if I were God, I don't know if I would have this kind of take on it, but this is just what it says. And I'm open to having dialogue, but, all of us are broken. Like, the world is a really broken place and we're here to really help each other out. And I'd love to hear more about your story. Like, that's just the kind of way they approach it. Is very much this apologetic, like, I don't really know. And they're trying to concede as much as they can, as opposed to saying, no, this is the case. That's what I've noticed.
And the language of the language that's often used, and this is used by liberal churches, but it's used by evangelical churches frequently too, is things like all are welcome here. And I think that phrase is more associated with liberal churches because it usually just means you do whatever you want. But I've seen plenty of evangelicals use that type of language or similar language frequently. To say something, to say pretty much like they may on paper, say that LGBT stuff is a sin, but they will then when they preach it in such a way that could be interpreted as being okay with it. It's vague. It's very common.
Well, it's like this. This is the way I think of it is, when you touch on the issue, it's not, this is a problem, but you can be forgiven. A lot of the time it's, yes, this is sin, but look at all these other sins too, guys. Look at all this. It's like deflecting it as much as they can and trying to make it like okay relative to other things. Like, well, who here isn't, who here hasn't struggled with lust and so on. So,
or they'll use I think it's called side B, the side B movement. But I think it was a movement in the PCA specifically, but kind of has a broader idea behind it now, where they'll be okay with people calling themselves gay Christians, and they don't necessarily mean by that someone who's someone who is literally in a gay marriage but attends a Christian church or something and calls themselves a Christian. But what they mean by that is someone who kind of almost accepts their sin as part of their identity, and they might not be outwardly practicing it, but they kind of accept it as part of their identity, which just does not flow at all with how Scripture talks about identity. I don't go around I do go around saying say I'm a sinner, and I also say I'm a saint because I'm a saint and a sinner. But I don't take as my identity that I'm a liar or something like that. That if that's your identity, I'm a lying Christian. That's the equivalent statement. That's that doesn't really flow with how the Bible talks about how our identity is founded. That's the equivalent statement of saying you're a gay Christian, for example. And a lot of evangelical churches are supportive of the Side B movement. Hence why it popped up in the PCA, which is, I'd say, is an evangelical church body, but is one of the probably the largest, more conservative evangelical church body.
And that's where it gets tricky. You said the PCA, like the
Yeah, I think the PCA is, broadly speaking, an evangelical body. It seems to mingle a lot with other evangelical figures, like just like not every evangelical, lots of evangelicals like Tim Keller, for example, who is PCA. There's like a large branch of the PCA that kind of leans into even megachurch culture and things like that.
Yes,
now, a lot of PCA is not. There's a lot of mix. There's a lot of variety in the PCA. It's a big tent. But I think in general, like the PCA is, broadly speaking, an evangelical church body.
I think if we were to look at it, especially in the terms of the political moniker.
Yes, yeah, and it is, but it is one of the much more conservative, and it's confessional, at least on paper.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the parishes are to the Presbyterian confessions. There's some looseness around the edges, I think. But even in that circle, this is where the Side B movement came from. Unless I'm mistaken, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that, though, because that's from the PCA. Let's see if I'm wrong about that. I might be wrong about that now. Let's see if I'm correct. I might be wrong. Don't quote me. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong.
But sure. I mean, regardless, what we see a lot is we see a lot of interaction with between evangelicals and certain big PCA figures. This is the point.
Yeah. And there are PCA figures who have talked about this. I believe that's what I'm remembering. I recall listening to a YouTube video about this topic, and the PCA came up at least. Anyhow, don't quote me on the origins.
Sure. I think it's just relevant to talk about how, in a similar way, you talk about the PCA as confessional, but it seems that there's not really a real confessional emphasis within evangelicalism at all. Like confessionalism, it's not just, we don't happen to have a confession. It's like a lot of time it's actually just straight opposition to confessions.
Oh yeah, that's
the Nudus Scriptura.
Yeah, that's Nudus Scriptura, exactly, or at least one of the parts of it, right? And that starts in the 1800s for sure, with like Church of Christ types of movements, like the Millerites, right? I believe that's the group. Millerites. Anyhow,
I mean that's a I think the Millerites are those who influence like Jehovah's Witnesses and so on.
Oh, is that remembering wrong?
Maybe you're remembering something wrong, but regardless, there's some movement.
Yeah. Regardless, yeah, this is where you get these groups that want to be called non-denominationals from kind of the Second Great Awakening era, and that has influenced evangelicalism because it's not entirely downstream of that, but there are plenty of evangelicals that are downstream of that.
Right.
So move away from confessional adherence is huge. And this is part of a broader trend that they kind of move towards liberalism over time, more and more, as we've been saying. But moving away from confessional adherence is part of that. Move away from traditional ethics is a really common one too. So like they've moved a lot towards utilitarianism, consequentialism, other theories, which ultimately will lead to egalitarianism, looser ideas on like cultural ethic topics like sexual ethics and things like that, etc. And that's all kind of, once again, this is downstream of liberalism, because if you're going to adopt a philosophy that is not rooted in kind of the historic Christian tradition and the milieu of it, and you're going to have this kind of like ideas based on Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment ideas, or that's where your philosophy is coming from, you're going to go towards these weirder ethical theories, just inherently.
Well, I think the general idea of kind of a consequentialism, and it shows up not only in ethics but also in other areas that they have. So a great example of this at the top of my head is looking at women's ordination. So one of the arguments I've seen from like Beth Moore, for example, for women's ordination is just, well, we need more people in the office. We need more people spreading the gospel. Not it's just straight up, well, you lose half your gospel force. You lose half your gospel force is what they'll say. It's like, I'm sorry, but that's just not the way we look at things. We don't look at them purely in terms of the effect. We look at the way it has been said in scripture that this must be.
Yep. And this is very influential too. Like think about ideas from evangelicals on foreign wars. So Israel's is the most common example, right? Just because it's tied with dispensationalism stuff, but it's the relevant example because it's the big one that is, well, the biggest topic in Christian circles. So regardless of whether your takes on geopolitics in particular or your takes on actually dispensationalism, the way that evangelicals will support things that the Israeli government does that violate just war theory, which is a traditional ethical theory, of course, they will justify these things with utilitarian or consequentialist ethics.
Right.
And say, well, this is like a necessary evil that has to be done. Or, they'll say, well, the alternative is this bad thing happening. Some group some Islamic group that does horrible things takes over or something like that. That's what they'll say. And, or at least some of them will say this, right? Once again, we're painting in broad strokes as it's a broad movement.
Right.
But that is not, that does not go in line with, traditional ideas from Christian ethics on traditional ethical theories like just war theory, like you'd find in Augustine or Suarez or Gerhard. There are plenty of writings on just war theory, and evangelicals don't subscribe to those at all anymore because they don't have that philosophical basis anymore. They've adopted liberal presuppositions, or post-Enlightenment liberal presuppositions, meaning movements downstream of liberalism.
Right. And it's just a very annoying thing to see because in a lot of ways, it's this consequentialism that doesn't actually help us at all almost. Like I know I'm speaking in consequentialist terms, but what happens a lot of the time is they're defending things that are like, this does nothing to do with Christianity in the first place.
Yeah, very, very common.
So,
yeah, I mean, I think also you think about like things that were done during World War II. There are evangelicals who will die hard support, the actions the U.S. did in World War II that were not in line with just war theory, regardless of who supposedly the good guys in whatever war were. You can't violate just war theory. You can't do an unethical thing just because they're supposedly the good guys. It doesn't get you out of ethical ethical violations.
An example that I like to. Okay, now I know he's a bit on the fringes because he's one of the more charismatics. But do you know who Greg Locke?
No, I don't know Greg Locke.
So he is a charismatic, evangelical. I mean, it's hard. I try to not mix evangelicals and charismatics all the time, but there really are, like, at least in the political machinations, they're like the same. And I would say in a lot of ways they just practically are. Let me see how big his church is. But he is a charismatic, prophet, so to speak. He's an American preacher. I mean, it's if you look him up, he's described as an American non-denominational evangelical preacher. And he's in Tennessee. He has a video where he straight up was like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the exact thing, but he just straight called for like the nuking of some country so that we can bring Jesus back. Like he just straight up says that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I'd have to find that's
literally the exact type of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah. Like
I have heard that being suggested as the solution to certain conflicts before.
Well, and complete disregard to who the actual people are and what's going on. It's just, well, we got to bring Jesus back. Like, boom, just hit him.
Yep. A couple comments here I'd like to address, then we'll move on to our next topic of this. There's a lot of throwing around the word liberal here. Liberal doesn't mean inherently wrong. I'm scared of the lib boogeyman, and I'll agree when I think the data supports it. We said this at the beginning of the stream, so you definitely have to go back to the beginning, but we are using the word liberal rather broadly. Back to the beginning, to clarify, we're not using liberal here to mean the modern political party or something of, liberal this or that necessarily, although they are related in some ways, nor do we necessarily mean theological liberals, although once again, it is related. We're using liberal, broadly speaking, to talk about certain aspects of the Enlightenment philosophy that come down today. Yes, we are using it liberally, pun intended, cosmic septic. But we're talking about philosophies, and then the things downstream of those philosophies that kind of come from this Enlightenment liberalism, and then once again the things downstream of it. So, for example, are the ideas of Karl Marx liberal according to Enlightenment liberalism? They're not really Enlightenment liberalism, but a lot of the ideas are downstream of Enlightenment liberalism. So that's what we're really talking about. And I happen to use a political figure there, but Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke would be an early figure that actually is, very definitionally an Enlightenment liberal. I don't think anyone disagrees on that. He's kind of like probably the most classic example of an Enlightenment liberal. But other figures downstream of that, like a lot of the American founding fathers, would be considered liberals. They might not have the exact philosophy of other liberals around them, but neither did all these other figures. Voltaire didn't have the exact same ideas as Locke, but they are both Enlightenment liberals or downstream of Enlightenment liberalism. So that is what we're talking about. We're approaching this from a philosophical angle, which is why we're talking about things like utilitarianism or consequentialism with just war theory, because those things are downstream from these philosophies. That's why we talked about individualism and the idea of what a person is. Well, that is tied back to Enlightenment philosophies and the things downstream of them. Like, does Descartes have the same idea of what a person is as, Aquinas? No. And that is related to his philosophy. And, how people think of persons today is, downstream of these Enlightenment ideas, even if it's not the same ideas, is downstream of them. There's a causal chain of seeing how the idea is related. So, that's how some of this comes through. Another one, the second one I wanted to address was, can America still be America without some form of liberalism, especially classical liberalism? Which in classical liberalism, and how Euler's people means it here, he is talking about people like Locke. It seems that America, he says, loses identity without liberalism. I think you can have, and this goes back to the previous comment about lib doesn't mean bad. I'm not saying that every single thing out of the liberal identity of the Enlightenment is like all evil or something like that.
Right.
There are a lot of problems with how it's formulated though, and the things it leads to, like as I said, the causal chain. A lot of the ideas that it's based on are wrong. Like a lot of its epistemological assumptions are wrong, and so that's going to lead to all these other kind of things down the stream, right? And so, for example, I think one way you could recover this is there are certain figures like Burke, for example. Edmund Burke is, he is a liberal, but he has a fairly different formalism from someone like Locke. Or you have like Fisher Ames, who's one of the founding fathers. Fisher Ames he has liberal presuppositions a lot of the time, but he has a very different form of what that means than some other figures.
Well, I think part of the way to look at it is it's not only that when we talk about evangelicals as liberals, part of it is like, well, what are they influenced by primarily? Are they primarily going to be influenced by the theological convictions all the time? Or a lot of the time they're more influenced by political stuff, as I mentioned earlier.
They are.
As I mentioned earlier, I would get more leeway if I were able to show them, oh yeah, George Washington says X, than I would say Augustine says X.
Yeah.
That's part of it. So being liberal is not automatically bad. It's more, part of it is there is a lack of awareness among a lot of them as to what their presuppositions are that they should be examining. And you can synthesize some liberal ideas, I am sure. But I'll put it this way. It would be a much better place if evangelicals, let's say they retain a lot of their liberal ideas, at the very least recognize some of the limitations of it and were willing to be more conservative on certain issues, especially when it comes to theology. The politics stuff, that's its own issue, but at the very least on the theology, as I said, it doesn't matter as much what George Washington thinks as it does what Irenaeus.
Yeah, exactly. There's kind of in some circles there is almost a worship of some of the liberal figures, like you're saying, like they're willing to accept Washington but not Augustine, and that is like, okay, Washington was a deist probably. A lot of the founding fathers had controversial religious views or unclear religious views. Washington was pretty Christian. Washington attended Episcopalian church, but frequently did not commune, I believe.
Oh, interesting.
He would leave before communion. That was a common trend apparently in the 1700s. Yeah,
that's so weird to me.
Yeah, I don't think they really believed it. I think they attended for social reasons. right?
Oh, it would make sense.
Yeah, because it's in the cultural milieu to go to church, right? So anyhow, are there any I would exclude from being liberal? I don't. I'd have to look more at their particular views. I can't think of any in particular, but I do like things Ames has to say, and I think John Adams has some good insights frequently. Anyhow, okay. Well, moving away from those questions. Let's see.
Because there's this one I want to bring up that we did not talk about from earlier.
Yeah,
there's one that I really want to talk about. Where is it? It's an old one. Oh, here it is. I got into a lot of trouble with evangelical Baptist youth groups for various reasons. You'll usually get in trouble if you even talk about, well, you ask an even remotely theological question at Bible study.
Oh yeah,
this is
the origin story of the YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's straight up our origin story. That's our origins, man. And I gotta say, I know. I should be clear. I know a lot of evangelicals who actually are very open on discussing these kinds of things. But man, I mean, is it worth discussing again what the origin story is?
Yeah, have we ever discussed it on stream, the whole thing?
I don't know if we have discussed the whole thing. You want to go through it? You probably have a better memory than I do.
Go through it. So yeah, so Jared and I were both involved in Campus Crusade. Also, I think it's just officially branded as Cru now, actually, because that's what it was called. So people just brand it Cru, CRU. So it's the largest parachurch organization in the world. It is, broadly speaking, evangelical. And we were at, this is at Michigan, University of Michigan, and we were in the same like Bible study, like campus area. They called them community groups.
Yeah, community.
And so it's a Bible study for your area campus through Cru. And we were discussing like original sin and in Romans. I forget which chapter Romans. But one of the chapters of Romans, like it was very on topic, and I had brought up like Augustine or something, and Jared was like saying the same type of things and was also bringing up, I believe, Augustine, and we were discussing like some of that, and our leader kind of like shut us down because we were talking about simul justus et peccator, meaning simultaneously Satan sinner. And we were just like affirming this, and neither of us were like confirmed Lutherans at the time. Like I was looking into Lutheranism. I was like considering going through confirmation, and Jared was not looking.
I hadn't even really known about specifically whatsoever at that point.
Yeah, but we were just discussing it because we were both into theology. So like we were just like discussing this stuff like openly at a Bible study, and we just got shut down pretty much. Like we were pretty much told like that the topic was too controversial or something like that to discuss simultaneously Satan sinner. Or original sin.
Yeah, that's and there's more than just that. And I mean, like in my case, I remember I've told this one I know multiple times, but it's relevant to bring back up. The Cru leader, was it like, I won't say his last name or anything, I don't even remember, but it's like Kyle or something like that. Got really mad at me for saying open theism is heresy.
Oh yeah, there's that one too. Yep.
That and the reason this is relevant actually for the stream is it's not just that let's laugh at the evangelicals. It's because like, look, what are they trying to do a lot of time? They're trying to be as moderate as possible, and they're trying to not cause like fractions within groups a lot of the time. And so when you take an actual theological stance that is frankly conservative, they are often very angry. I'd been told like, I am a fairly self-aware person. I should be clear. I'm fairly self-aware. I can recognize if like, all right, I'm being a little annoying. But I remember talking about theology in like a group chat, not one you were in, Seth. And they got mad at me and they're like, well, this really isn't the place that we're trying to make this like a more chill place. Like, they texted me separately, like the leader of the entire thing texted me separately. He's like, look, we really like you, but we're trying to keep this like a non, we want to make this a more welcoming, opening place. And I'm like, I wasn't even saying anything controversial. I was just talking about like St. Patrick. Like, that's serious. I was just telling them like, oh, look what St. Patrick, like he's cool. He did some good stuff. And I remember telling Pastor kind of, and he just started like laughing really hard. He's like, what's the point of going to any kind of group if you're like the things of God are spurned like that?
Yeah. And but anyhow, that's kind of how Jared and I became friends was through that. And eventually we both became Lutheran, and then this YouTube channel was, a few steps down from there.
Mm-hmm.
Down the road, that is. I hope not. I hope not a few steps down in terms of content or knowledge. Anyhow, our next topic was we were discussing a movement towards liberalism over time. We talked about like confessional adherence, ethics, other ones liturgics, which I think a lot of people like don't think about this too much. Maybe some people do. I think about it. Is that even among Protestants, people were more like formal and liturgical in the past, and they may not have had the historic liturgy. A lot of them were more downstream of Reformed, but even some weren't. I mean, like Anglicans and Methodists. Anglicans are obviously they're still very liturgical. Methodists, some are a little more liturgical, but a lot aren't. But Methodists used to be fairly liturgical. They were low church, like that's part of their movement and identity. Coming out of Anglicanism is that they were of the low church variety, but that didn't mean they didn't maintain a lot of the form of the liturgy. They did, and other groups like Baptists actually did have like a liturgy that was kind of downstream of the Reformed liturgy was fairly similar, which is not the Reformed liturgy is not too like historic of a liturgy. It is like it was a new liturgy kind of made during the Reformation, but it was nonetheless like a specific form of worship that had good order. It did have things like reading of Psalms, and it had frequently benedictions, assurance of pardon, which is kind of like an absolution. Actually, there was at least one early Reformed liturgy that did have an absolution in it, like an actual absolution, in the early 1500s. Closing prayers, the Lord's Prayer, creed, sometimes, things like that. Those things were common among Protestant churches, basic liturgical things. But in the 1900s, there was a urban-rural divide, and evangelicalism became less liturgical, and while the liberals actually were sticking to liturgy, which I'm going to come back to this in a second. But this is really this was really kind of an urban-rural divide. Urban areas were more liberal, which also meant often being more liturgical. And I think some of this was related to status. I think some of it was related to, thinking of yourself as serious people and things like that. Whereas in the rural areas, which tended to be more conservative and thus more evangelical often, rather than like mainstream liberal, they were less liturgical. And this kind of goes later to the seeker-sensitive movement, which we'll talk about. But I think a lot of people get kind of confused when you try and tell them, especially of an older generation, you tell them like, oh, well, really liturgical. They kind of might associate that with liberalism, actually. But I think this is really an urban-rural split. But I think the move towards being less liturgical actually is a liberal move, because you are moving away from the things that have been passed down to you. And the reason I say this is because in the same way that a lot of Enlightenment philosophy and also the philosophies downstream of the Enlightenment kind of like throw off the things that came behind them, liturgy is another thing that goes along with that. And as you move away from these traditional forms of liturgy, you also move away from those same beliefs, because you're not affirming the creed every Sunday or something like that. You're not maintaining the things that have been passed down to you by your spiritual fathers. So it's like it kind of is it's a liberal move in the sense of that it's removing the things from behind and kind of trying to be not necessarily utopians, but it is like new is true, which is the opposite of what Christians believe of what's new is not true. What's old is what the original thing is actually the true thing.
Another thing I think that's relevant to mention on this front actually is, as we've said before, a lot of the move away from liturgy has to do with the seeker-sensitive stuff, or maybe not the move away from it, but the keeping it away. You talk to evangelicals, it's like, all right, I like the liturgy. Like, well, how is someone new going to show up and like understand things? Like fundamentally, the way that evangelical like seeker-sensitive churches build their churches is for people that aren't in the church. They build it for people that are not members. We build liturgical churches build it for people who are members.
Yeah, and that is also like that is in a way that is a progressive progressive mindset, because you're trying to be like the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
And you view the world as good. You're viewing the world. I'm not saying I'm not being Gnostic and saying creation or material is bad, but I'm saying that worldliness, the things of the world, are good. That's what the evangelicals are effectively embracing with seeker-sensitive movement, or they're at least saying they're at worst neutral, and therefore can be brought into our church. Mm-hmm. And obviously you can plunder the Egyptians, right? You can take things from the pagans and sanctify them, but that doesn't really seem to be what they're doing.
No.
Like they're not taking in, for example, a folk song that is like a generic, worldly folk song, that was sung out in the fields by the peasants in the Middle Ages, and then turning it into a hymn tune. That was sometimes done. Although less frequently people would imagine. Some people try to make out all hymn tunes to be like bar tunes, which was actually rather uncommon. It was much more common to take a folk tune, meaning something that was sung by people while farming, things like that.
Yeah.
Or actually just take up Renaissance classical tunes and just turn those into hymns. That was also very common. But anyhow, doing that is, taking just a folk tune and then turning it into something that is good and easy to sing for corporate worship and helps you memorize the words of a hymn. That is very different from what the evangelicals seem to be doing, which seems to be embracing the entire concert experience frequently.
It is.
That is not sanctifying it. That is actually just bringing in the bad thing into your church.
Yeah. There's Seth, I don't think you've ever watched King of the Hill, right? I don't think you've ever.
I've watched some episodes.
Okay,
I've not like watched a ton though.
Okay, but there's an episode. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's one where Bobby gets really into like one of those. He goes to, I can't remember like if it's part of the Methodist church, but they have a youth group that he starts going to, and they're like a stereotypical like, oh man, we're so into like skating, and all of a sudden he gets really into Koho, and at the end he wants to perform Koho like on stage with somebody, and Hank talks to Bob. No, he either talks to Bobby or like one of the rockers that's there. And he goes, "You're not making Christianity better. You're making rock and roll worse." Like that's just true. Like it's funny, but it is true. Like, what are you actually doing by just bringing in a lot of the things of the world? I'm not saying it in the sense of like, oh, rock and roll is sin. Or I'm not saying it like pop music is automatically sinful. Like, I'm not one of those people that's like, well, have you seen the video of Seventh Day Adventist? It's like the drum beats like actually.
Oh,
like,
I've heard that one before.
Satanic.
I've heard the drum beats are evil before.
Yeah, I've heard that. Like that's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is like fundamentally what they're doing is they're trying to take like, well, what's popular in society today? And like, how can we basically just do that ourselves, but Christian? And it's frustrating because like the whole point of the church is to not be what the world is. The whole point is to show up and it's something completely different. It's something you will not get anywhere. But a lot of them, they're building it as like, well, here's just a worse version of what you can get already.
Yeah. And you are seeing a reversal in this now. Like in general, in more liturgical bodies like Anglicans and Lutheran churches, and I'm not talking on main lines. I'm talking about, within the more conservative varieties like the LCMS or continuing Anglican churches, things like that. The ones that are, more liturgical tend to be the more conservative ones now. You are more likely to find congregations drifting into theological liberalism that are more contemporary. So I think like the urban-rural divide has kind of slowly fell apart as the cultures in general has become less Christian. And so like the idea of being like a mainliner and having like this good liturgy and stuff as being like a thing that is needed for culture and like showing your high status, like that is gone. Like if you want to be high status in America and just like go places like in the business world or something like that, you're probably not going to do that. You're going to maybe join a country club or, business groups, things like that. Or maybe not even any at all. Maybe you would just like network in businesses at networking conferences and things like that. And you definitely would not bring religion into it.
Well, ironically, of course, that's the whole, there's a lot of evangelicals are obsessed with the leadership ideas now.
Oh yeah. They are. They're super big into that.
And that's how they form their churches. They look at their church like a company.
Yep.
They fundamentally are like, well, what can we take from companies and make it into our church? And I'm not saying like, all these principles, the concepts of leadership are bad or anything like that. But sometimes it's like you're making your church just doing like TED Talks.
Yeah, and some of those ideas at the conferences are good, actually. Some of those, a lot of the conferences give you actual, ideas that work in the business world, and they might actually be relevant to your church for administrative reasons. Sure. It is not your. But they really embrace it hard as if it's like a theology thing, and then it seeps into their preaching and how they do services and things like that.
Yeah. Like there's a guy I know who, like a contrary example of this. I know a guy who's really into the whole. Like he does a lot of stuff with like search engine optimization stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like SEO stuff. And it does not touch his preaching whatsoever. It does not touch his church whatsoever in terms of that.
But it might be useful for your website, right? Like
that's pretty much it. Like it does not change him on that. But that makes me think, I'm sorry, another King of the Hill reference here is when Ted was on a song. He's like a Buddhist historically, and they see him at a church and he's like, we're Episcopalian now. it's good for business. Like it's just straight up, it's good for business. That's his.
It's good for
that's not some biting social commentary or anything. I just think it's really funny. Like I mean, it is a commentary on how some people like in the business world will see themselves, but that doesn't have to do with our video per se.
No. Although it actually does remind me though. The business idea definitely relates. I think of like viewing the church as a business is definitely not a. I don't know if that's necessarily downstream from the liberal tradition. It might just be downstream of people being evil. But
I don't think it's downstream.
Although I did think of the relevant Burke note that and obviously Burke is a liberal, but Burke is like a very particular form of liberal that is like, as Kirk calls him the conservative liberal, and Burke really hates on the economists of his time because they're like these empiricists that just crunch numbers constantly, and a lot of evangelicals kind of do that, where they're like so focused on number crunching of like membership and things like that, or church finances, that they really lose sight of the right picture. Which I don't know if once again, I'm not sure if that's actually downstream from liberalism, but I thought of it that I was like, yes, Edmund Burke hating on the economists as he calls them. Which Jared and I both studied economics.
Yeah, we both study econ. Yeah, but I think something funny that's kind of along that line is, from my understanding of it, like mega churches actually have massive, I guess you could call them like they have horrible retention rates or turnover rates, whatever you want to call them. I know I'm using business terminology, but like in a lot of ways, the way those churches build themselves is just bring people in and don't really do much after. I mean, they have like Bible studies and so on, but of course there's the infamous video of Stephen Furtick saying, if you've been Christian for a little while, like my church isn't for you, we're for new people.
Yeah,
it's just insane when you think about like historically. I mean, imagine like Gregory of Nyssa or somebody saying that. Like imagine like after Cyril of Jerusalem's catechetical lectures at the end, he's like, well, you can come here for a few more weeks and go to this guy's. Like, can you imagine that? He's so funny. I mean, not a good way, but just like it's comical historically.
So. I think like the last point I have on this is that I think with a few exceptions only, like I have in mind like the SBC in the late 20th century, the evangelical movement has only moved in a liberal direction. Yeah. Maybe I think there are certain pockets of the evangelical movement that today are flipping on that, but I think more are just going even stronger into liberalism. But in general, since in its history, I've never seen it substantially, move in a conservative direction.
And do you think part of that has to do with the way that society moves?
I think they go where the wind blows. So, and I don't think that's grassroots. I think that is top down. Actually, I think like there's it's built into the seminaries that how the seminary system is set up is that some of the seminary professors are going to adopt some of these more liberal ideas. I think that a lot of evangelicals, because they're so influenced by particular American politics, if American politics moves more liberal, they become more liberal with it. And I think a lot of them, because I think of like contemporary worship, if they're trying to like mirror like certain like cultural practices in their churches, they're going to end up adopting some of the ideas from them, even like kind of subconsciously or in implicit ways. And so I think like inherently the system is built in evangelical churches that they're going to move towards more liberal ideas over time, and for the most part, not in a more conservative direction. Like I said, like SBC in the late 20th century may be an exception to the rule, but in general.
Yeah, I think I would say that's my prediction too. I can't imagine them getting more, like, I just can't see them getting more conservative. I just don't see that. I think
as a whole, not. You'll find certain areas doing here or there, but on general, on the whole,
right? Yeah. Exactly. It's very much, well, like I'll put it this way, and this is not me trying to make a specific political commentary too much, but like Trump is not an historic conservative by any means. No. There's no way he is, but like a lot of evangelicals really heavily attach themselves to Trump.
Oh yeah.
Or when they really are like really heavily, and those who oppose him are not opposing him typically from like he's not conservative enough. A lot of the time they will use that kind of language, but then they're like, oh well, I'll just vote for like Kamala or something. Like that's often how it is. Like I think everybody makes fun of David French for that reason. So a lot of the opposition to him isn't from a like, well, he's not actually preserving Christian values. A lot of the time, it's just basically just more liberal talking points historically.
Yeah. So I don't have a ton more to say.
I don't either.
All right. Well, I guess to conclude, are evangelicals actually liberals? Yeah, they are. By and large, they are liberal as a liberal movement. They are founded as kind of moderate liberals, at least in the modern conception of the evangelical movement. They have a lot of liberal presuppositions, meaning liberal as in ideas from Enlightenment liberalism or downstream from that. They have more liberal ideas on ethics, liberal ideas on culture. They may not be, modern socialist progressives or something like that, but they are nonetheless liberals, and not building from, I guess, older philosophical ideas or critiques. Yeah.
I would actually like to say I hope you guys will keep us in your prayers. Nothing horrible is happening. It's just Seth and I went to Michigan, and tonight's Notre Dame Ohio State national championship, and I think I'm going to cry. No, I'm gonna have
embarrassment.
I'm gonna have fun because I'm actually going out to a bar restaurant with friends who are at my church at ULC. Who one of them he graduated from Ohio State, and he was a trumpet player in their marching band when I was in the marching band at Michigan. So he has a great picture of himself in 2021, the first time we beat them in a while, and obviously he's like way across the big house and you can't see me, but I could point and I'm like, this is where I would be in this photo. Like, this is where I was. And another guy who he graduated from Notre Dame as his undergrad. So it's going to be fun though. I'm actually really looking forward to it. So yeah, I'm going to cry. I'm rooting for Notre Dame myself.
I think it'll be a good game. Yeah, I'm rooting for Notre Dame because you can't root for Ohio State.
No,
I know they're technically in conference, but it's Ohio State. So
yeah, I'm not rooting for Big Ten, but
we're on a hiatus from Notre Dame anyhow. We don't start
2033 is the next game, I think.
Yeah, I think something like that.
The funniest. This is what I told my friend Jacob, who's the Ohio State one. I go, the funny thing though is if you win this, it just makes Michigan's win over Ohio State way funnier this year.
Oh yeah.
That's the one. Like that's the silver lining for me. Is
if
it's
Ohio
like
State won,
I could laugh at you even more.
We beat the national champions if Ohio State wins. That would be something.
And this wasn't like, oh man, a good Michigan offense. Like no, we were horrible on offense.
Oh, I don't know. I think we were mediocre.
No, Seth. Statistically, we're horrible on offense.
You think we were below average for the entire league, or just?
Yeah, I think we were like I think I'm dead.
I don't know if you take into account FCS teams. I think.
Let me. Well, okay. FCS. Let me look. Sorry that this is where it's going, but I got to do this. I got to fact check.
We played hard teams though.
That's fair. That is fair.
Would we actually have a worse offense than Western Michigan or something? No, I don't think so. Point. I don't think so.
I do think that is a fair thing to bring up, but we were in the bottom half, if I recall.
I can see us being in. I guess I don't know. But you could be the bottom half and still be mediocre if you're 40%.
Yeah, Seth, we were the total the rank. I'd have to see how the rankings were done, but we were out of 134 teams, we're 113.
Oh, okay, that's pretty bad. That's worse than I thought.
Yeah, that's
not mediocre. That's bad.
Yeah, that's bad. But we fired our offensive coordinator and we're getting Bryce Underwood. So
yeah, I do think our offensive coordinator was rough and having also the second half of the season was way better. We really had trouble with QB figuring out what are we going to do with our quarterbacks at the beginning.
Yeah,
but
one final thing. Actually, I do want to say one final thing because Kozar sent me something.
Oh yeah,
Kozar
cool.
He. Forgive me, Kozar, if you do not want me to say this on stream. I can't imagine him not wanting to, but he makes a good point. He says evangelical megachurches are not actually appealing to seekers as much as they're appealing to evangelicals who think a more seeker-friendly model is where they want to attend. Yes. So appealing to non-Christians, actually appealing to Christians who are almost always dissatisfied with their current church.
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of evangelicals talk about their convert numbers, like how many new members they get at their churches, but so many of those members are just people coming from another church. It's just, I don't want to say it's sheep stealing, strictly speaking, because some people might be leaving voluntarily. Some of them might be sheep stealing, but some of them I'm sure are leaving voluntarily.
Oh, there's evidence that Elevation will purchase ad space specifically in where churches are. so
Yeah.
they can sheep steal. Like that's a
Yeah,
real thing.
so that actually is sheep stealing, and yeah, that is a common, I think, real problem. And I don't think you can just look at new members and say, oh, look, our church is growing. Not that church growth is like as far as numbers go, is a measure of how healthy the church is either, or how good or how correct its theology is. But the idea that membership means you got a convert is not true. Like tons of new LCMS members are also converts from other forms of Christianity, not from being, not Christian at all.
Yeah.
Roman Catholics become Lutheran or something like that, or Presbyterians become Lutheran. That is a common phenomenon. So just new membership does not mean true converts in terms of like not saved to saved.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Thanks for watching,
yeah.
everybody.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for encouraging or experiencing our discourses or discourses on a variety of things. So,
yeah.
all right.
Everybody have a good day.
Yeah. Bye.